In this section, we'll be adding a little bit of practicality to the kind of share exploration that we've been doing so far. And we'll do so with this really awesome tool called Snaffler. If you haven't checked Snaffler out, the GitHub link is here as well as in your workshop guide. This is a fantastic tool for auditing of file shares. It's incredibly powerful. It takes in custom configurations and all kinds of really advanced things that you can do with it. The way we're using it here in this particular workshop is kind of just barely scratching the surface of its functionality. So highly encourage everyone to explore Snaffler if you haven't already. But I've gone ahead and ran it here as a user who has access to all the file shares that we've created. And we see that when we run it, Snaffler will kind of go out, crawl the network, look for open file shares, and we see that all these test file shares that we created earlier, it finds them no problem, and it has access to them. That's why it's marked in green here. And if we scroll down a little bit, we could also see that not only is Snaffler looking at the file shares, it's actually crawling the files and the file contents that are hanging out within the shares. So it actually found our passwords.txt file that we were looking at earlier, and it looked inside of it and said like, oh, okay, this might be a password here. And due to the file name as well as the contents inside the file, you can see the regex here that it's matching on. It found a whole bunch of other stuff here. Some of this stuff is false positives, some of it not. But overall, we ran this execution in order to get a sense of what kind of share crawling actually looks like. So we looked at the 5145 events earlier. So now let's look at them in the context of a SIM. And I'll be using sumo logic here. But the query syntax between Sumo and Splunk and Sentinel is pretty similar. And I'll go ahead and kind of explain what all these queries are doing as we go along, so you can go ahead and actually recreate them in whatever query language that you're most comfortable with. So I'll zoom in a little bit just so we could see a little bit more clearly. And I've gone ahead and run this first query, and we'll go kind of in order here. The first step is baselining. So you want to understand what is accessing your file shares and by how much. So that's exactly what this query is doing. It's looking at the event ID 5145 that we've been looking at so far. And then the next couple lines here are just renaming fields so that we don't have to type in event data, a relative target file name every time. It just renames them to something a little bit more sane. And then we just go ahead and count the file name and as file name count by share name. So we're just counting what shares are being accessed in the environment. So we can see here in my small lab, sysvol is here that's being accessed. The IPC share is being accessed. And something really important to kind of keep in mind while we're going through these queries is that we aren't really looking for, system enumeration or Active Directory enumeration. We are actually going to go ahead and exclude the IPC shares and sysvol in the next query here that I'll look at in a second. And we're doing this because we're looking for file share access itself and files within that file share. We're not really looking for enumeration, so we're not looking for your bloodhounds. We're not looking for session enumeration in this particular case. If you are looking for that kind of activity, then the IPC share is definitely something that you should be looking at. So just something to keep in mind as we're looking at the subsequent queries, that we're looking specifically for malicious or suspicious file share access, not so much the enumeration component of it. So we do the baseline and we have a good sense of, okay, yeah, sysvol is pretty noisy, IPC is pretty noisy. So our next query here is the exclusion. And it's exactly the same as the previous query, but here we're actually excluding, the C dollar share, the admin share, the IPC, sysvol, and that logon. So we're excluding shares that are pretty noisy in environments. And if you're doing this kind of operation in a production environment, you're going to find a lot more noise. So when I do this here and, it looks super neat and quick and easy, that won't be the case in a production environment. You might have to spend, a couple weeks, depending on the size of the environment, maybe even a couple months with a team to actually go ahead and exclude the file shares that are kind of benign and that you don't need to pay attention to so much, at least in this context. So once we exclude these shares, at least in my small lab environment, we see pretty clearly that we have this one IP, and that's the IP of my Windows 11 workstation accessing the logs file share, and we have the files that are accessed. So the next step here is to scope this query a little bit more, and that's what we have as a next step. So you can see the kind of order we're going in. We're starting with a pretty broad baseline, then we're narrowing that baseline down a little bit to not the system file shares, but the actual, user created file shares, as well as the files that are in those file shares. And then we're scoping it. So once we know that, okay, hey, there's a passwords.txt file hanging out in the file share, or we actually ran Snaffler from the blue side of things from an audit standpoint, and we know where the files are, we can actually go ahead and scope the query. So if file name matches password or passwords, set a flag as 1 for this sensitive file access field. And then this line 13 here is scoping the query to only when sensitive files are accessed, or what we deem sensitive files are accessed. So this regex can be expanded upon, it can be tweaked to match your particular environments. But this order of operations has kind of served me well, where you baseline, then start excluding, and then start scoping. So that's exactly what we're doing here. We have a baseline of what general file shares are accessed. Then we have another query with noisy file shares excluded. And in this query, in combination with running tools like Snaffler or auditing your file shares through other means, we have a sense of where sensitive files are, and then we scope the query to only include those keywords. And then we see here that this IP address, which in my case is Windows 11, this is where I ran Snaffler from, accessed this logs1 file share and accessed the passwords.txt text file within that file share. So just like we did previously, these first 3 sets of queries here, this baseline, exclusions, scoped, this will flag on successful file share access. But what if we do something like this, where we run Snaffler as a low priv user? And we could see, if I could just find the window here, that in this case, this low priv user did not find the test file shares that we created earlier because we explicitly denied access to them. So we could look for that as well and look at a count of shares that were failed. So this is counting only failures. So this line 3, where keywords not equals audit success, this is only failures. And what we could do then, once we again have a good sense of a baseline of how many failures are normal for our environment, because in production environments, share access failures will occur no matter what, even if the access permissions are set up properly. So it's really important to baseline. And once you do have that baseline, you can then go ahead and set a threshold. So in this query here, we're counting the number of failed shares that were attempted to be accessed by a user and IP address. And then on line 8 here, if the share fail count is over 14, and over 14, this is an arbitrary number. This makes sense in my particular lab environment. For production environments, this number will be much different. We just set a flag, and then we only return results where the high share failure count is set to 1. So we see our results here, and we can see that, hey, this low priv user failed to access 17 file shares, which in my lab environment is abnormal. Again, in a production environment, you're going to see accounts that are, failing to access file shares all the time. And that's where this baselining comes in as a critical thing to do, both for failed access as well as successful access. So just a quick recap. What we did here is we ran Snaffler, and we ran Snaffler from our normal account that does have access to the file shares, which you can see here. And we also ran Snaffler from an account that does not have access to the file shares. So we can see them. They're not listed here, though the shares that we created earlier in the first step. We then ran a couple queries here. The first query baselined the file share access. The second query excluded noisier or benign, and benign as applicable to this particular detection that we're building. We excluded these file shares, and then we scoped the query down. So rather than looking at everything, we only want to see if the file name that was accessed contains the word password or passwords. And again, this regex can be expanded upon. And then after that, we looked at the same or almost the same query logic, but we looked at failures in this case, and we could count and see that our low-priv user failed to access all the test file shares that we created, and in this case, failed to access them 17 times. So hopefully that section was clear. It might take a little bit of back and forth with the workstation guide, where all these queries are available as plain text for you to copy, paste, and tweak, and what have you. So thank you, and I'll see everyone in the next section.